The studio lights were blinding and the air crackled with tension. It was supposed to be just another panel discussion, one of those polished, rehearsed spectacles where public figures exchanged sharp words under the guise of civil debate. But what no one expected was that a quiet figure seated off to the side would become the storm's epicenter. There she sat, poised, composed, and seemingly detached from the high-octane conversation happening just a few feet away. She had always preferred to let others speak first, always knowing the power of silence. Until, of course, that silence broke. By accident. The broadcast was live. Cameras were rolling. The audience at home watched with popcorn in hand, expecting fireworks, but not like this. As tensions escalated between the panelists, one voice, not meant for public ears, suddenly pierced the well-choreographed chaos. A low, measured tone, calm but unmistakably firm, drifted through the speakers. At first, it was unclear where it came from. Producers scrambled in the control room, desperately signaling to cut audio, but it was too late. She had leaned in to speak, perhaps thinking the cameras weren't on her, maybe assuming that her mic had been muted. The words were meant as a private warning, a subtle yet deliberate check on a rising confrontation. But those watching at home heard every syllable, clear, unapologetic, and devastatingly direct. It wasn't a shout, it wasn't a tantrum, it was more like a pressure valve releasing, controlled, precise, but powerful enough to shift the room's energy in an instant. The reaction was immediate. On the panel, the once boisterous atmosphere seemed to still, as though time had momentarily paused. One panelist, who had been leaning in with animated gestures just moments before, froze mid-sentence. Her expression twisted, not in confusion, but in recognition. Recognition that something had just happened, something serious. The woman who had spoken hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The gravity of her words hung heavy in the air, impossible to ignore. Every viewer, whether watching from a kitchen TV or a phone on the train, leaned in a little closer. Something raw had just broken through the glossy facade of live television. Social media caught fire within seconds. Clips of the moment, recorded and reposted in real time, spread like a digital wildfire. The audio wasn't even that loud, but it didn't need to be. The sheer fact that it wasn't meant to be heard made it even more powerful. Commentators on rival networks tried to play it down, but the moment was too gripping to dismiss. That voice, long known for staying out of political scuffles, had just crossed an invisible line, and not by accident, but by a rare moment of unfiltered honesty. Producers in the studio looked panicked. Earpieces buzzed with frantic instructions. Meanwhile, she sat back in her seat, her expression unreadable. Not embarrassed, not regretful, simply still. She didn't reach for her mic. She didn't rush to clarify or apologize. It was as if she knew exactly what she said and wasn't afraid of the consequences. Perhaps she had grown tired of being silent. Perhaps this moment had been building for a long time. Whatever the reason, there was no mistaking the shift that had just occurred. For those who had underestimated her, it was a reckoning. For those who knew her better, it was a long time coming. She hadn't meant to speak into the microphone, but she also hadn't whispered. The warning, though not intended for public consumption, was crystal clear. It revealed not just a private frustration, but an inner resolve that had been carefully masked for years. No political slogan, no rehearsed applause line, just raw, unscripted conviction. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just what was said, it was the silence that followed. That silence screamed louder than any debate. It was the sound of a room, a panel, and a nation realizing that the rules had just changed. Jasmine Crockett walked into the studio that day with her usual energy, confident, sharp, and unapologetically bold. She was used to the spotlight, used to sparring with critics, and used to walking into a room knowing exactly how to own it. From her posture to her precise choice of words, everything about her radiated a sense of control. As the cameras rolled and the discussion heated up, she delivered her lines with conviction, leaning forward, eyes bright, her signature smirk flashing with each retort. She was clearly in her element, or so it seemed. As the segment unfolded, her voice rose, building momentum as she addressed the issues with her usual fire. Each time someone tried to cut in, she parried effortlessly, tossing back rebuttals with rhythm and ease. She had done this countless times before. Audiences expected this from her. Hosts relied on her for moments that would trend, and she never disappointed. But as the conversation swelled and reached a tense crescendo, something happened that no one on set, and certainly not Jasmine, had anticipated. In the middle of her most impassioned point, just as she was settling into a strong finish, a voice came from off to the side. Calm. Barely above a whisper, but impossibly clear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it cut through the noise like a needle through silk, and Jasmine heard it. The moment was subtle, but unmistakable. Her eyes shifted slightly. Her hand, which had been mid-gesture, paused in the air. The corners of her mouth, previously curled upward in a knowing smirk, flattened, then dipped. It took less than a second, but it was enough. That flash of control she carried like armor cracked, just a hairline fracture, but 1 millions watching at home would replay again and again. She tried to recover, to continue speaking, to reassert dominance in the conversation. But something had changed. Her rhythm faltered. Her voice, though still steady, lacked the same punch. She glanced just briefly toward the source of the voice. That glance spoke volumes. It was a mix of disbelief and disbelief's quieter cousin, humiliation. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and sharp, like the sting of a paper cut. What had been meant as a private aside, a simple cutting remark, had been broadcast live. The mic had picked it up. The cameras hadn't panned in that direction, but the sound was unmistakable. And Jasmine knew it. Everyone knew it. A single line, delivered without venom or volume, had changed the entire tone of the exchange. The panel didn't know how to react. For a few seconds, there was that odd kind of silence that only happens when no one knows what to say next. A producer's voice crackled faintly through the earpieces, trying to steer the discussion back to safer ground, but the energy had already shifted. Jasmine continued speaking, but the power dynamic had flipped. She was still trying to climb a mountain, but now the wind was in her face. People on social media didn't miss a beat. Clips of her expression, frozen mid-response, were posted within minutes. That moment, she realized, became a trending caption. Analysts would later call it one of the most unexpected shifts in tone ever captured live. But in that moment, it wasn't a trend. It was a gut punch. She hadn't expected to be blindsided, especially not from someone who wasn't even engaged in the verbal brawl. That was what made it so potent. It wasn't a shouted insult or a theatrical put-down. It was calm. It was measured. And it was precise. The kind of remark that can only come from someone who doesn't need to yell to be heard. Jasmine tried to regain her footing. She answered questions, redirected the focus, even smiled again. But something had faded. The spark, that glint of amused confidence that had defined the first part of her appearance, was no longer shining quite as brightly. She was still speaking, but now people were watching with a different kind of curiosity. Not because she was commanding attention, but because something about her had visibly changed. Something fragile beneath the surface had been touched. The moment had passed in real time, barely 30 seconds from start to finish, but its impact lingered like a sudden shift in the atmosphere before a storm. Those who witnessed it knew they had just seen something rare, not the kind of outburst or stage confrontation typical of high-profile television panels, but a slip of truth, a flash of unfiltered honesty. And it came from someone who had long made a career out of staying in the background, saying less, observing more. When the voice emerged from off-camera, calm and cool, no one expected what followed. But it wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said. This wasn't the language of confrontation. There was no raised voice, no slam of the hand against a desk, no dramatic pointing or cutting glare. The words were spoken softly, almost matter-of-fact, but with the kind of edge that only comes from someone who calculates every move with the precision of a chess master. It was quiet, yes, but there was no mistaking the intent. This was a warning, not a suggestion, not a plea. A boundary being drawn in real time, one that had been crossed and now would be checked. The viewers at home didn't just hear it, they felt it. It struck differently because the person speaking was known for restraint, for elegance, for choosing dignity over drama. So when the line came through the live mic, raw and unfiltered, it landed with the weight of 10 louder voices. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't crafted for applause. It was real, and because of that, it sent shockwaves through the room. The authenticity of it was almost startling. In a world where public figures are coached, stage-managed, and measured to the syllable, this one misstep felt more genuine than anything else said during the entire segment. People had seen her before, always poised, always composed, rarely, allowing emotion to seep into her public demeanor. But here she was, no script, no safety net, just a moment of truth that was meant to stay behind closed doors, but spilled into the spotlight instead. Some would later call it a calculated power move. Others would argue it was a lapse in control. But those takes missed the heart of the moment. It wasn't about strategy or showmanship. It was about a line that had been crossed and a line being redrawn, quietly, sharply, with intention. This wasn't an outburst. It was a reveal. A glimpse into the steel behind the silence, the quiet command behind the calm surface. What made the moment all the more powerful was the contrast. She had barely spoken a word up until then, content to let the chaos swirl around her. She had watched, listened, sat still while voices clashed and egos sparked, and then, just once, she acted. Not with volume, not with spectacle, but with precision. And that one moment said more than any monologue ever could. It caught the panel off guard. It caught the audience off guard. The reaction wasn't loud gasps or shouting, it was silence. That kind of uncomfortable silence that takes over when everyone knows something has shifted, like a page had turned and there was no going back. The person who had said so little for so long had finally spoken, and the room was different now. What followed was awkward. The panel tried to resume the conversation, to pretend nothing had happened, but the energy had changed. Even the person who had been on the receiving end of the warning seemed shaken, not just by the content, but by the source. There's a unique kind of disarmament that occurs when someone you assumed would never speak up suddenly does, and does so with more force than anyone else in the room. She didn't offer clarification. She didn't apologize. She didn't need to. The words, though unintended for broadcast, stood on their own. They didn't require defense. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They were a reminder, delivered softly but with unmistakable authority, that stillness should never be mistaken for submission, and silence never confused for weakness. And in that one unscripted moment, her presence went from background to center stage without her ever needing to raise her voice. The moment the words were spoken, the shift was instantaneous. Not because they were shouted or laced with anger, but because of how completely unguarded they were. A few syllables, spoken softly and almost out of frame, transformed a live broadcast into something that felt personal, intimate even. The cameras continued rolling, the hosts stumbled forward with their scripts, but no one was really listening anymore. The real story had already unfolded, and now the fallout had begun. It started with confusion. Producers blinked at their monitors. Crew members exchanged glances. Was that really said out loud? Was her mic still on? Within seconds, confirmation came not from the control room, but from social media, where the clip had already been isolated, trimmed, and shared. Viewers with quick fingers had caught it immediately, replaying the moment over and over. The tone, the timing, the unintended candor, it was all there, raw and unrehearsed. And for many, it was shocking not just because of what was said, but because of who had said it. No one had expected a response like that from her. Not there, not then, and certainly not in the way it happened. She had built an image of controlled elegance, the kind of person who measures words like precious stones, never wasted, always weighed. But in that split second, without filters or finesse, She delivered a line that felt more real than anything else said in the entire broadcast. And the world noticed. Online platforms exploded with commentary. Analysts scrambled to interpret the moment, dissecting tone, facial expression, and possible motivations. Some wondered if it had been a calculated tactic designed to make a statement without officially making a statement. Others insisted it had to be a slip, proof that even the most composed individuals can falter when provoked. But no matter how it was spun, one fact remained clear. The remark landed with devastating precision. People weren't just talking about what had been said. They were talking about how it made them feel. Viewers described feeling a chill, a shiver of secondhand tension, as though they had just eavesdropped on something they were never supposed to hear. It was the kind of moment that pulled audiences in, not through performance but through a glimpse of something unvarnished. And in a media landscape often dominated by the artificial, that kind of authenticity is rare. In the studio, things grew awkward. The panel tried to continue the conversation, but there was no regaining the previous rhythm. A few attempted jokes to diffuse the tension fell flat. One host tried to pivot to a new topic, only to fumble through his notes. The person on the receiving end of the remark sat noticeably stiffer than before. The earlier confidence dulled. A shift in posture, a slight narrowing of the eyes. She knew the cameras were still on her, but she also knew the focus had changed. The woman who had spoken sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She made no move to clarify or respond further. She didn't apologize or even glance at the others. If anything, her stillness became even more pronounced, as though daring anyone to challenge what had already been said. That silence became a statement in itself, calm, deliberate, immovable. News outlets jumped on the story with predictable urgency. But what made the moment so potent wasn't just the press coverage. It was the fact that it couldn't be ignored. Unlike a written statement or a public address, this hadn't been orchestrated. It hadn't gone through a press secretary or been filtered by a legal team. It had simply happened. In front of everyone. Live. Even hours later, reactions continued pouring in. Politicians weighed in cautiously. Commentators split along familiar lines. But everyday people, viewers who had stumbled upon the clip while scrolling through their feeds, were captivated. They weren't responding to politics or policy. They were responding to a human moment, a moment of raw reaction that broke through the plastic gloss of broadcast television and reminded everyone watching that sometimes the quietest voice in the room can change everything. The broadcast eventually wrapped, the lights dimmed, and the chairs emptied. But the moment lived on. Immortalized in pixels and sound bites, replayed in slow motion across every platform. And though it may have lasted less than a minute, its reverberations would last much longer. It had cut through the noise, not with volume, but with unmistakable weight. As the cameras finally cut and the broadcast faded to black, the moment continued to echo far beyond the walls of that studio. In an age where sensationalism often overshadows substance, this instant stood out not because it was loud or flashy, but because it was real. What viewers witnessed wasn't part of the scheduled program, nor was it some carefully timed media stunt. It was a brief, unscripted flash of truth, raw, unpolished, and impossible to ignore. There was something almost cinematic about it all. The build-up, the tension, the quiet drop of a single line that shifted the room like a tectonic tremor. For those watching, it was like watching a play where one character suddenly breaks the fourth wall, not with a speech, but with a whisper that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. It reminded audiences that power doesn't always come from who talks the most, but from who speaks with clarity, conviction, and timing. What unfolded wasn't just another viral moment. It was a cultural pulse check. Viewers didn't need headlines to tell them what they had just witnessed. They felt it. That's the thing about authenticity. It doesn't need explanation. And in that quiet interruption, something was exposed. Not just in the conversation on stage, but in the wider conversation about respect, presence, and restraint. The aftershocks were as revealing as the moment itself. While commentators scrambled to interpret what had been said, ordinary people connected with something deeper. It wasn't just about politics. It was about posture, principle, and poise. It was about the rare kind of strength that doesn't need a microphone to make its point but still finds its way into every ear. That voice, barely raised, had spoken louder than all the noise that surrounded it. And for the one who had been so sure of her place at the center of the conversation, it was a sobering reminder: not all power announces itself. Sometimes it sits quietly, watching, waiting, and then speaks once, with precision and finality. That's what left everyone stunned. Not the volume of the words, but their weight. Not the delivery, but the intent. Long after the debate itself was forgotten, long after the segments moved on and the trending hashtags cooled down, that moment remained etched in the collective memory. A soft warning, a misjudged silence, a forgotten mic. All it took was a sentence, meant to be private, but heard by millions, to shift the balance and remind the world that silence isn't weakness, and subtlety isn't surrender. Sometimes the quietest voice is the one that